Hi, everyone. Good evening and happy Thursday. Welcome to Housing as a Human Right, Tackling Challenges of Affordability and Discrimination. My name is Elizabeth Nearing, and I'm the curator of Ideas Programs. The International Festival of Arts and Ideas is created and produced on the traditional lands of the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Paugussett, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac in the land we call home, Connecticut. We hope that from wherever you are, you can take a moment to acknowledge and honor the Native people whose lands you are on and the history of the place you are in. I'm going to put a link in the comments if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, where you can check out Native land near you and learn a little bit more. The International Festival of Arts and Ideas stands with Black Lives Matter and with countless citizens in our own city and across the country who are exercising their right to protest the systemic racism at the root of police violence. The festival stands in solidarity with Black and Brown communities who are targeted and abused by unjust systems of oppression. And this year, our Ideas programming has been created in collaboration with an abundance of thought partners here in our city, our state, folks who have been watching the festival and wanting to know what's going to happen with it and really contributing to the actual content. And one of our core thought partners in a lot of this work has been the Connecticut Mirror. And this is a partnered event with them, and they've really helped us shape and talk about this issue through their work. As a part of the Ideas series, this is also presented in partnership with Connecticut Humanities and additional major support from the Whitney Center and with media support from Connecticut Public. So thank you everybody for coming along with us on this journey. We still want to have your thoughts and your questions, your ideas, as even during this talk itself. So if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, you can write a comment in and we will get to as many questions as we can throughout the panel. And without any further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce you to our speakers tonight. We have Karen DuBois Walton, Executive Director of Elm City Communities, Jacqueline Rabe Thomas, a reporter for the Connecticut Mirror, and Alexis Smith, the Executive Director of New Haven Legal Aid, moderated by the one and only John Dankosky. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And it's great to see all of you. And it'll be great to see all of you who are watching this evening in the comment field. As Elizabeth said, we would love to hear your comments. We'd love to hear your questions. There's so much to talk about. I started talking with the International Festival of Arts and Ideas about doing this program months and months ago. And the idea was that the Arts and Ideas Festival was going to be focusing on democracy as a theme. And one of the things we said is, over and over again, we heard from people that you can't talk about democracy if you don't talk about housing. So we set off on this journey to talk about democracy in what we thought was going to be an election year. Yeah, it's still an election year, but that might not be the most important thing that happens this year. Since that time, we've had a coronavirus crisis that has shut down the state's economy, and it may be causing an eviction crisis, something that we can certainly talk about. It has made people rethink about the way they work and where they live. And just within the last couple of months, so much has happened since a series of police killings that have really made people think once again about how we live in cities, how we live in suburbs, how we live together, and the real causes of police violence and racism in America. And I think that one of the ways to maybe start this, and Karen, I would like to start with you, is, if we can't talk about democracy without talking about housing, I sort of feel like we can't talk about racism without talking about housing. And there's really deep historical ties to all this. Maybe you can set the stage for our conversation and talk about some of that history, because the questions of redlining and housing segregation, these are not remnants of a long ago time. These are things that are still very present today.
Thank you, John. Absolutely. Good to be with you all. The history of housing discrimination in this country goes back really to its founding around property rights and who was able to own property and who was owned as property. And so there is absolutely a long history about this, and the connection in this country of wealth creation and home ownership is so tight, and I think explains a lot of the wealth gap that we see currently. The history of housing discrimination, redlining, who was able to get mortgages, how public housing and affordable housing even developed in a segregated manner as well. All roots back to the very original sins of this country around race and racism, and who is centered and who's not, who's allowed, who's privileged, who is deemed as welcomed and who isn't. I think we see very clear connections to what we're experiencing now in very segregated communities, where we can see different COVID impacts in communities. We see different levels of violence, police violence in communities. We can live in communities and not be aware of what happens just a few miles away because of the level of segregation that remains today. So deep roots, but very current ways in which it's experienced currently for us.
And I want to get into some of those deep roots and how they are being experienced throughout the course of our program. Jacqueline Rabe Thomas, you've been reporting for quite some time about housing segregation in the state, a big project that you worked on with ProPublica. Maybe you can put a little bit more meat on those bones too, and talk a bit about some of what you've found and what you've been reporting just in the last year about how housing segregation happens right here in our state. Not hearing Jackie for some reason, and I want to make sure we know why. What I may do is turn to Alexis to maybe pick up on what Karen opened with, and we'll make sure that we've got Jackie's microphone back. Alexis, would you like to pick up on this? Perhaps the historical ties that we're talking about right up to the present day, and where we see segregation in housing right now.
Absolutely. I mean, we represent about 1,400 people a year in our office, and well over 50% of those individuals are individuals coming to us with housing cases. And when I say housing cases, those are people who are being evicted, but they're also people who have housing conditions, whether that's mold, lead, and so much of the housing stock that our communities that we serve live in is housing stock that was built before 1970. And so there are a lot of issues that those individuals have with the units that they're living in. So we see the remnants of segregated housing on a daily basis in our work. And I would point out another very recent example that we've seen is, because of the health pandemic, so many young children are now at home learning, and the disparities that we see in the distance learning that's been offered really varies from city to city, from town to town. And so what that impact will have on the already achievement gap that we see going forward, and the early start of the summer slide, we will see for decades to come.
Hey, let me turn back to Jackie and make sure we can hear you okay. Can you hear us? No, we're still not hearing Jackie. So I don't know.
Now?
Oh, now I can hear you. Yes.
Okay, I'll just take off my headset. Sorry. Not sure what's going on. So, yes, I mean, some of the findings that I came across when I was looking at Connecticut's history of affordable housing is we have on the books this really great law in theory to help accommodate the production of affordable housing. But when you look at where it has been built, it has been predominantly in struggling communities, and overwhelmingly housing for significantly lower income individuals. So there's not really a diversity to it. If you look at certain communities throughout the state over the last 30 years, in 36 towns, there's been no net gain of affordable housing, period. In a quarter of Connecticut's municipalities, there's actually been a decrease in affordable housing in what the pure percentage is of its affordable housing. And so that leads to things like Connecticut having some of the most segregated metro areas in the country, period. The Bridgeport, Westport, Fairfield area ranks #1 for its segregation in the country. for socioeconomic. It ranks number 8 for segregating Hispanics. It ranks number 18th for segregating African Americans. You know, New Haven and Hartford, unfortunately, are not far behind in those metrics. So the reality is, when you have things like in Monroe requiring 70 acres to build a single or a multifamily unit, you're not going to have multi-units. You're not going to have economic diversity. And so that has led to a place like Connecticut being more segregated than ever.
So Karen, could you pick up on that a little bit and talk about how the very specific way that Connecticut governs itself, the fact that we have these towns right next to cities, and you have communities in the suburbs that have absolutely no interest in building affordable housing. I mean, what does that do for the issue that we're talking about here?
Sure. Connecticut is unique, maybe similar to some other New England areas, but the power of local rule in Connecticut has resulted in each individual of the 169 municipalities being able to create their zoning policies and rules for their town around how they're going to develop. You know, and you don't need to travel far to see other models of government, places that have a county level government or do things in a more regional way. When I talk with my colleagues in public housing, they're sort of shocked at the size of the footprint within which I'm able to work, whether it's for operation of housing or development of housing, being so limited to just within the city limits of New Haven. Other places would be looking, in other places, the state of Connecticut would be a county, in terms of size and area to look at. So with zoning being able to be determined at the local level and being tied to things that are on the books, say things like, preserving the character of the town. When you layer that on top of a history that has created towns that are segregated with predominantly white families and segregated Black and Brown communities in the urban center, when you layer let's preserve the character of the town on top of a real racist history and an anti-poverty history that's led to the development of those communities, you have in place things that are trying to preserve segregation, whether people recognize that on the surface or not. Zoning policy, that we've got towns that will prohibit multifamily development, that you must build single family homes. We have towns, as Jackie mentioned, where the acreage is defined in the zoning such that that single family home must also be, a McMansion, and that's on the books. There was also zoning policy that is so tied to the public investment, so places that don't have public sewer systems become very unfriendly to affordable housing. So there's structural things that really prevent or have been used to really prevent the growth of affordable housing into every community, such that families who really should have choice are finding themselves limited. Even through the voucher program, we often find that families find the rental property in communities to be unwelcoming to lower income families seeking to rent. So we have some real structural and some real ideological or behavioral things at play in Connecticut that are making it challenging. We've sought to.
Yeah. No, I was just going to ask Alexis. I mean, when you hear the phrase "let's preserve the character of the town," I mean, what specifically does that say to you?
That's as unwelcoming as you can say. That is, I want to preserve the town the way it is, and I want to keep it as white as we can. That's what I hear. I think we find this as well when clients of ours have the opportunity to move to the suburbs. I think there's a couple of things that are concerning for them. One is how welcome will they be? How welcome will their children be in the school system? How will they, most of the time their jobs are in the cities, how will they be able to get to the cities? A lot of times their families are still within the cities. And so this ability to stay connected with your family, stay connected with the people who are closest to you is a real is a real dilemma for many clients. But I do think the bigger issue is how are we going to get past this idea that the language that we use, preserving the town, keeping traffic patterns low. I mean, all of those things just scream to me, we want to preserve the birds or preserve nature. I mean, all of those things scream to me, we want to keep this the way it is and keep it as white as possible.
And Jack, go ahead, please.
Drill down for a second to those character of the town reasons for not building. So let's talk about some of the other reasons that are giving. The safety will be impaired if we allow affordable housing. There's no sidewalk in that community, or the sewage capacity doesn't provide for that. But you don't see hey, by the way, the developer actually said that they would build a sidewalk, or they actually, are proposing paying for the sewer extension, and it's held up in court for 5, 6, 7, 8, sometimes 15 years. So, there's these surface level excuses, but then when you start to drill down in some of the projects, you're like, something else is going on here. It's not about the sidewalk. There's a sidewalk that's being proposed, that's being paid for. Or just if you want a sidewalk built, require it. Or, there was a project specifically in Westport that I looked at, and they weren't willing to even sit down with the neighboring town about a second access road for, they felt that there needed to be a second access road, and they weren't willing, and it was on the abutting town, and they weren't even willing to have a conversation with that town about making it feasible. So they were coming from a place of no versus a place of how can we make this happen.
And Karen, something that Jackie and I have been talking back and forth about, and I'm sure that you've seen this as well, is over the course of the last several weeks, an awful lot of suburban communities around Connecticut have staged Black Lives Matter rallies. Often those communities are predominantly white, and the predominance of the people who show up at those rallies are white residents. They care very much about this issue. But the fact of the matter is that they've voted time and time again to put policies in place, just like the ones that you're all talking about, that have kept people of color from living in their communities. I guess I'm wondering what we can say about this particular moment right now, as we have so many suburban residents of Connecticut saying, yes, I want to do something about that. I mean, what would you say to them, Karen?
Well, I think this is offering a moment to really think about what does it mean to walk into efforts to become anti-racist in work. I think we as a society have such a history of hearing racism and anti-racism and shying away from any discussion because nobody wants to be labeled as racist. And so we can recognize the egregious acts of violence that we've seen on TV and recognize that as racism. But we have more difficulty seeing the everyday ways in which we support systems that are racist. And so what I hope in this moment is that it will challenge all of us to begin to look at what are those things that are happening that are sustaining privilege for a few, and excluding opportunity for so many. And so I hope that that's a moment for that. I also like to remind folks, though, that their vision of affordable housing and who's using affordable housing is not always accurate. I look at the wait list here at the Housing Authority, and a third of our applicants are coming from the very towns that are refusing to build affordable housing. So there's a need that towns aren't addressing for residents that have an address of record in that town. And then we see too many instances where when affordable housing is built, it's built in a way that perhaps is for elderly residents who towns tend to have less concern about, or it's built and really begins to look more like workforce housing with real efforts to ensure that only sort of higher income affordable units are built. And so I think it's a moment for us to really put into practice what we are holding signs about and marching about right now. The next time there's a developer wanting to do a project in a town, the next time there's something coming up for zoning, I hope that the moment will translate into a real movement around this.
Alexis, do you have a thought on that?
I do. I'm actually very hopeful. I mean, I think the individual suburban towns have held their own rallies, and they've reflected, I think, the demographic of that town. But if I look at many of the demonstrations, not only in Connecticut, but around the country, what a diverse group of individuals that are participating in these demonstrations and protests, and so many young people. So I do think that this is a critical moment. I do think that this is a moment. I've said, that the child shall lead us, and so I think we need to let the youth lead us, because they do hold, I think, a very critical piece of our history going forward. And we can, I think it is an opportunity, as Karen said, to try to put into practice and identify some of these systems that have been in place and what individuals can really do about it. I mean, I have seen a lot of individuals who have taken the opportunity to start educating themselves about the history and about how we can make change, which makes me very hopeful.
I want to get to some questions from some of our viewers here in just a moment, and keep the live comments coming, because we will get to some of these questions. But I think to that point, Alexis, you talking about the hope that you have, maybe it's a time for me to ask each of you about what around this issue of housing, affordability, and segregation, what do you think has changed in your mind or in the minds of others during this very unusual year? I mean, we didn't think so many of these things were going to happen. We didn't think that there would be mass protests of the scale that we've seen. We didn't certainly think that we would have a coronavirus shutdown that would affect the economy the way it's affected things. First of all, from your perspective, Alexis, what has changed about this issue this year, either for the positive or for the negative?
Well, I mean, I think the health pandemic has really given rise for a lot of people to see the disparities that we have from a health standpoint, from an economic standpoint. It's just, I think if you didn't know before, now you definitely know. And the number of low-income individuals who have been impacted from an employment standpoint, the number of people who are not able to pay their rent, which is a huge issue. There are people who have not been able to pay rent since March, right? So all of those things have come to light. I think what we're seeing with, if I could shift a little bit to some of the police violence incidents that we've seen because of the health pandemic, people have been home, and people are now seeing these things. It's you are home, you are trying to work from home, you are juggling whatever, but when you watch on TV, when you watch on your iPhone over and over again, a man literally losing his life, I think that impacts people, right, in a way that it didn't necessarily before. You couldn't avoid that. It's not just in the newspaper where you miss the article. You are seeing that. And so I think this has just been an opportunity for so many of these things to be really present and allow people to want to address them in a way that they haven't necessarily before.
I would agree with that. I think it's this moment has really exposed how fragile the safety net in this country is, and how for working families, how close people are. People say just one paycheck away from instability and on all these ways, and I think that's been important. I think also, though, the opportunity to really center focus on what's been called essential workers has really helped us think about the people who are doing work that each of us depend on every day. And we're looking at how little we are reimbursing people for their very essential labor. I think we're noting that the people that are so essential can't afford to live in many of the towns where they're providing these essential services. So I think it's just exposing in a very glaring way and dispelling some of the myths that we tell ourselves about the U.S. economy and the U.S. middle class and who's essential, right?
Yeah, no, this idea of essential workers, how much we pay them, is something that we've had conversations about at, say, the state capitals. As we talk about minimum wage, but Jackie, you and I have these conversations about what happens at the Capitol all the time. Politicians pat themselves on the back. They say, well, yeah, it used to be only $7 an hour, but now it's $9, now it's $11, and maybe it'll get to be $15. We hear in the comment field from Lizzie here, it says minimum wage is $11, but a person needs to make almost $25 an hour to afford fair market rent for a 2-bedroom apartment in Connecticut. Right. So I don't know, Jackie, I mean, right there, that says it. It doesn't really matter if we're doing better than we used to do. We're doing a hell of a lot worse than we should have been doing with $1968.
Right. Yeah. So I'll just point to someone who I interviewed for the series that I did about Separated by Design, and Shana Cunningham was making minimum wage, and she actually had to work a second job. She was taking care of other people's kids during the day at a daycare, making minimum wage, and that wasn't enough to care for her family. And she was living paycheck to paycheck. And then she got in a car accident and lost her car. Couldn't get to work anymore. And so, so many people are living paycheck to paycheck. And so just for her, just talking to her about sort of what's your reality for housing? When she lost her car, that rendered her homeless as well, because she could no longer afford rent. And so for her, reality was getting just an efficiency unit would be great for her. And that's sort of the housing is a right. We're allowing people to think that an efficiency is their best case scenario. She's got 3 kids. And looping this back in with the policing, she lived in an area that the Opportunity Atlas, I would recommend everyone to look it up. Opportunity Atlas, you can look up what your zip code is and what you're more likely or less likely to be arrested in your town, what you're more likely to make in your town, the kids growing up in your town. The town I think her son was 14 years old. Data shows that her son was 5 times more likely to be imprisoned by the time he was 30 years old. I mean, that's the reality for her that she's living through. And we can save for another day the debate about the role that policing has in that, as far as the total number of police in her community and whether or not that's helping or hurting. But her reality is she knows that her son is more likely to be incarcerated than 2 miles away in Fairfield. And that's our reality here in Connecticut.
Alexis, you looked like you were going to jump in before. I wanted to get to you if you could.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also really important to note that while I think a lot of people have come to the realization of, the disparities that exist within our state, and the importance of essential workers and that people aren't paid enough. I think it's also important to note that COVID has also shown that there are some people who were doing very, very well, and that in fact, COVID has allowed them. I think we have one individual in the country who's on the verge of being a trillionaire. Right. And so there are other examples of those individuals. And so sure, we can talk about the disparities, but we also have to recognize that there are some situations, even the health pandemic that we're in right now, that some people are really profiting off of. And so we need to address all of that kind of together.
Such a great point, because I think we're so conditioned to approach these issues from a position of scarcity, as opposed to really recognizing the tremendous wealth in this country, and that the issue is the disparity between those who have that there is enough money in this country to ensure that everybody has a right to safe and decent housing. We've just chosen not to ask folks to pay their fair share on this. We've allowed all sorts of tax loopholes and things. We offer more for wealthy homeowners in the mortgage interest deduction on the federal side than the government puts into affordable housing services. Right. Those are value statements that we have allowed to happen on our watch as voters in this country, and I think things we have to pay attention to. I look at the families, and I'm so happy Jackie brought up a real story, because I look at the families, and people have such misperceptions about who lives in affordable housing, who lives in public housing. The families that I work for every day, the typical profile is somebody who's working multiple jobs, usually 2 jobs, and not able to move themselves out of poverty. We look at a state that has a median income over 70,000. We are operating in a city that has a median income more like 38,000, 39,000. We're serving families that the average income across our families, or the median income, is like $14,000 to $16,000 a year for a family of three. These are families who are struggling, that through the pandemic, through a loss of income, even if we're able to adjust, or when we're able to adjust their rent down to a lower portion, these are families that are so destabilized by what's been happening, that we've looked at this ability to cancel rent for people, and intend to do that for our residents, because I think people need to keep in mind just how destabilizing this has been, and the long-lasting impact of people trying to get caught up when they've been behind now, perhaps March, April, May, June rent as a result of this, utility bills now coming due. So I think we have to be thinking from a place of abundance, not scarcity, and think about how we're allocating our resources so that everyone can actually have experience the right to safe and decent housing.
Since you brought it up, Karen, I wanted to maybe go to Alexis, and all of you can jump in about some of the programs that have been made available. They're not going to last forever in terms of people getting some sort of help in paying their bills. Then there's also the question of, as Karen raised, canceling rent, a movement to just say, look, this is not about deferring. This is about getting rid of rent for a certain period of time. Now, Alexis, from your standpoint, where do we stand with some of these programs right now? And also, where do we stand with the idea that we probably need to go a step further, or a step or two further, for a lot of people who are hit the hardest around COVID?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I'll address the step further, because that's kind of what I'm thinking about, and I think it's I think we do need to think that realize this is a long-term issue. This is a long-term problem, and we have some temporary fixes right now. So there was a number of moratoriums that the governor imposed. So there's a moratorium on people who, on landlords filing eviction actions. But the reality is that there were a number of actions filed even after that moratorium was implemented. There's a moratorium on foreclosures right now. But the concern that we have is those are coming to an end very soon, within the next month or so. And so what will happen then? What will people do when rent is due? And so I think that's why, as Karen mentioned, this movement around cancel rent is so critical, and a movement around providing rental assistance to people, because people have not been able to find jobs again, or their hours have been really reduced, or they're being put in a position where they have to decide what are the safety risks, so they can return to work, but they may not be protected as someone like me who mostly works from home at this point, right? I'm not put in that position where I have to make the decision about safety when it comes to my employment. So I think those are the realities, and I think there are other examples. There has been around student loans. There's a movement there as well, which also impacts a number of not only low-income folks, but moderate to median income folks as well. So I think this really is an opportunity to look at all of these things that we do use to segregate people, to keep people out, to exclude people in a number of different contexts. Just as another quick example, in order to become licensed to practice law, you have to take the bar exam. And there has been a number of conversations about how what the bar exam will look like this summer. And there was talk about canceling the exam period, right? And just allowing, if you were in good standing and graduated, to come on board. And the debate on that was really interesting, because there's people who are of the mindset that, we need to have some kind of standards and we need to have rigor and people need to pass an exam. And on the other hand, it's, well, this is an opportunity to be inclusive and to have people enter the profession that may not have been able to before because they couldn't afford to take the right kind of test to prepare them for the exam. So I think there are all of these questions and all of these conversations that are happening in a number of different contexts.
I don't know, Jackie, from the standpoint of what is coming down the pike as the COVID crisis continues, even though we're starting to go back to work here. I mean, what do you see as far as problems looming with evictions, with renters not being able to actually come up with the money when some of these programs run out?
So, there's data and then there's stories. The data shows that the governor's office did a survey of landlords that made up about 9% of all the rental housing units in the state. And 17% of the 17% didn't pay their April's rent. By May, it was 22%. And by next month, it's expected to be 22%. Be able to not be able to pay their rent. That's 140,000 people in the state of Connecticut, 140,000 families who don't know how they're going to pay next month's rent. The census, they do a weekly pulse, and 3/4 of those people are minorities. They're not, you're talking about a certain population that is being disproportionately impacted economically by the pandemic. And so just to, put that in perspective of, there's data and then there's families. Dina Butler is someone, lovely woman that I met, lost her job because she got sick, took 2 weeks off to recover, as everyone says you're supposed to do, to make sure you're socially distancing yourself. And then there wasn't a job for her to return to. She's still waiting for her unemployment benefits to come through. I mean, she is one of thousands of families like that in the state of Connecticut that don't know how they're going to make their rent next month. Her brother, she fortunately has a brother who was willing to work crazy hours as an Uber driver and at another job to pick up those hours. But that means he's now interacting and becoming vulnerable to getting COVID. And so when you translate that to the data that shows who's getting COVID and who's dying from COVID, African Americans in the state of Connecticut are 2.5 times likely to die from COVID in the state. That's the reality. That's one of the higher rates in the country. It has reciprocal effects when people need to pay rent, they go to jobs, they put themselves on the line, more so than, I know my privilege. I know that I'm able to work from home, and I appreciate that. But I also appreciate that there are other folks out there who don't enjoy that same privilege.
We got a note here from Erin Boggs, who I think many of us know in this world. She says, so far the state is acting on being in a prayer, giving federal funding for COVID relief to towns in Connecticut rather than creating a rent relief fund, hoping that there will be more money coming from the federal government. A few other comments here, which I think are interesting, and there's a bunch of people who are putting their voices in here. Patella says, please include housing and segregated housing issues concerning folks with disabilities of all ages. Is housing in the community a human right? Why are folks sentenced to live in institutions because home care is not provided? Karen, this is another very important issue, and I think it's vital that we talk about housing for people with disabilities.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's one of the fastest growing populations. And when we are redesigning our properties and building now, we're building far more accessible housing, ensuring that. But it is well below. We know that the portfolio across the state is well below what the current need is, let alone the projected need. So the need to incorporate the needs of our families who are living with a disability is a very high priority in terms of the issues that are facing housing right now. One of the reasons that, in addition to the relief that we hope to provide to our residents by our own effort around cancel rent, is to hopefully model for others, to call upon the city and other towns that are receiving CARES Act money to hopefully use some of that for rent relief. and to model for other landlords that it can be done. We, being one of the larger landlords, think that we can have some impact on the way that people think about this, and whether it's an opportunity that they should be offering as well for their tenants.
We have a question here from Shelley, who asks, what are some opportunities to coalition build in this time to address housing discrimination and affordable housing? Anybody have some thoughts about that?
So I have a quick place where people can direct their attention to right now. The state is currently, actually, they're taking comments right now on how the state allocates its affordable housing portfolio. So the state's 9% housing funding, they actually have what's a plan of, how the points are divvied up to determine who gets that money. Historically, the state has spent $2.2 billion over the past 30 years. 80% of that funding has gone to the highest poverty communities for low-income individuals, and it's not been directed largely at diversity of who those properties are for. And so right now the state's taking comments on that to determine where and how to divvy up its money next year. And I think the comment period closes at the end of next week. So that's one place.
There are also additional federal relief bills that are pending, the House and Senate, and those are places also. Senator Sherrod Brown has a bill pending that would put billions more into housing assistance. And those are opportunities also to continue in this moment of crisis. What is the opportunity that we can move forward around ensuring that people have housing? So I'd raise that also as an opportunity for people to get behind something. And then the it's local, right? It's local. It's combating the NIMBYism. That's something that everybody can do when something comes up. And I think in Connecticut we go beyond NIMBY also. And people talk about banana, right? Build absolutely nothing anywhere near anybody. And everybody has an opportunity to raise their voice at their local zoning board meeting. And, if there is a benefit to COVID, it's that everybody's holding their meetings on Zoom, and you don't even have to leave your house to participate in your local government process. So Zoom into a meeting and help advocate for. Let electeds know that the town is not full of people who are NIMBYing or bananaing, but that there are people who actually want to see opportunity created in their town, and let electeds hear from you.
I've never heard the term banana before.
There you go. Build absolutely nothing anywhere near anybody.
I've learned something new. Alexis, how about you? Have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think embedded in Shelley's question is really the importance of involving the community in a lot of these efforts, and being, with community and listening, and finding out what it is that the community needs when we're moving on these policies. So, all these efforts I think really make sense, and we can realize some change. But I think being a part of the community and having people who are the ones who are impacted and experiencing this be part of this movement is really, really critical.
A question here from Connie, who writes, what are you finding? Are landlords still trying to evict Black and brown people in high numbers? What about municipalities and utilities turning off water and electricity, etc.?
So the eviction lab, it's a little dated, but you can see how different communities actually compare in their evictions. And Connecticut, Waterbury is in the top 20 in the country as far as its eviction rates. So if you're curious how your town is doing with evicting, it's not really to the direct question that you were asking about minorities being evicted, but you can see your town and how they're doing.
Interesting.
The work of Matthew Desmond has been really essential in shining a light on the crisis around eviction. And it is not overstating it to say that we have a crisis around affordable housing in this country. And it is a combination of the lack of hard units, the lack of subsidy to help people get into units, and the prevalence of eviction and how eviction is it has grown to be, the criminal justice impact on males has been so well documented, and it's the eviction crisis, particularly on female-headed households that are becoming that have become incredible destabilizing forces. I should let Alexis touch on this, though. This is her area.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what we see. I mean, the largest demographic of individuals that we represent in evictions are Black women with families, with kids. Eviction court is one of those systems that I think we really need to think about dismantling, if I can say that, or really revising. I mean, there's an inherent power imbalance that happens when tenants go to court each day. Typically, you have a landlord who, will try to get you to sign some kind of agreement, right? And that agreement isn't always in your best interest, right? One of the things that we see very regularly, and I'm sure Jackie sees this as well, is when you have an eviction on your record, it's almost like having a criminal conviction on your record. Your ability to find housing once you have that eviction on your record, it becomes very, very difficult. It impacts your credit score. And so when people are going to court and they're entering these agreements or getting these judgments against them, they don't always realize kind of what the long-term impact is. But the demographic is one I think that we see kind of across the state and across the country, and it is mostly women of color.
On the point about evictions impacting you for a very long time, it's not just the court scrubs its records every like 8 or 9 years, so you can't see anything going back further than that. But the problem is that I can't believe I'm going to say there's a problem with FOI. But the problem is that with the Freedom of Information Act, credit rating agencies are pooling that data every single month and using it in their credit rating for clients. So some of your bigger landlords are using that against people. And that's something that the court record, scrubbing its records after every 8 or 9 years, doesn't fix when there's a credit rating agency that has it on the books forever or for however long they want to be able to use it. There is a lawsuit that some fair housing folks in Connecticut have filed to sort of challenge that practice. And I don't know where the status of that is, but it was filed maybe a year ago now. And so that might be changing in the near future. It's happening around the country though.
I mean, these are, some of the ways in which we build systems that are doing the exact opposite of what we want, right? I mean, we run a large affordable housing entity, and we do not run people's credit, because if you need affordable housing, it is not surprising that you're going to have had trouble paying some things in the past, that your credit rating may not be stellar. That should not be a barrier to your accessing housing. We've moved away in the past couple of years of charging the first month's rent and security deposit up front. We let people move in because you've waited for affordable housing on a wait list for a long period of time, either literally homeless or paying far more than you could afford. So you're likely not going to have a nest egg saved up that's going to allow you to pay those kinds of things right up front. And we also are a very low actual evictor of families, recognizing that we need to work with families to get them back into lease compliance in ways, and not set them up for failure. So not set them into a repayment agreement that is going to be far more than we know at signing that they can afford. And so I think there are also some movements afoot to address some of those things more broadly, to eliminate the credit screening on things. So there are also some movements related to those kinds of items.
Go ahead, Alexis. I know you want to jump in.
One thing I'll add about eviction court, and this actually goes for courts generally, as we kind of come out of this shelter shelter in place and come out of some of the difficulties of the pandemic is what court actually looks like the next several months, right? So people will not probably physically be going to court. The judicial branch has said they are trying to do as many telephonic hearings as possible. They've already started some of that. But the concern that we have is, the individuals that we represent don't necessarily have the technology that you need to be able to participate fully in that. So how are we facilitating that process for people? And what does that mean? If someone is over the phone or Zoom or Teams or whatever the latest technology video conferencing is, how does a judge receive that? How does a judge make determinations, and what are the biases that a judge may hold in making those determinations that he or she needs to? And so I think that's a concern we have as well.
But what's interesting though is, if we can look at this period that we're in with some sort of a glass half full, there are things that are different. The fact is that you can take part in some sort of a town meeting in a way that you wouldn't be able to before because everyone's meeting online. Now you can log in. There's clearly a technological barrier for an awful lot of people in Connecticut. But Alexis, if you were to design a system, might there be something in the future about the way that we handle something like eviction court that is substantially different than what it was? Because there were also barriers for people, actually physically getting to the location as well, which maybe we can overcome if we have the right technology. I don't know. If we want to dismantle it, and you said we should dismantle it, let's what can we do better? What's the new design?
Yeah. So if I couldn't dismantle it, one of the ways that I would address it, I think you're absolutely right. The for anyone who's had to go to court, typically you're not there for a short period of time. So the number of clients that we have that have to take off work, that have to figure out childcare, sure, all of those things are potentially eliminated with the ability to use technology to participate in court. But I do think that there are some things that you lose if you're not in person, right? If you're not being able to stand in front of someone. And I think we're seeing that in a number of different contexts. The ability not to be able to be with someone in person and tell your story, right? Because I think that's a lot of what we try to do. We try to get our clients to do is tell the story. What is happening? What is going on? Why are we in this situation? Why are you in this situation? And I think you lose a little bit of that over Zoom or whatever video conferencing that you're using.
This conversation is reminding me a bit of the imagination that's needed in the defund the police conversation, where people default to their frame of what policing has looked like. And I think there's an opportunity to dream a different system, right? That could, and it look different than the eviction court we've come to know. Something that focused on mediation between the two parties, something that recognized that, I always say to our property managers here, a resident who hasn't paid, it's not that they're sitting on a chunk of money and they're just taunting you by not paying their rent, right? Folks don't have it. And so, a new system that looks at rent relief funds, that had rapid rehousing funds appropriate, systems that built in financial counseling and literacy for people. A lot of people, I'm a firm believer you can't budget yourself out of poverty. But I think we can certainly help people with with a system that built in some relief. Some ability for landlords to get paid, something that didn't damage the tenant going forward, allowed them to build some competency around their money management. Could be a very different system that didn't look like our current housing court. I think we can dream a little bit. This moment is calling us to dream some new things.
Yeah, and it doesn't even necessarily, though, seem like the most difficult dream to attain. What you're essentially asking, Karen, is for people to assume the best of someone as opposed to the worst of someone. And so many of our systems are set up to assume the worst of people, the worst possible intentions. And that seems like an easy thing to just have a mindset shift, but that's one of the most difficult things to change. And how do we start to change people's attitudes toward that, because those are well ingrained.
Yeah, I think we're very punitive around poverty, right? And we set up systems that middle class folks would never want to subject themselves to. The amount of disclosure that poor families have to do in order to access any sorts of services, to me, is rooted in real prejudice and bias against low income families. And I do think that just as we started this around thinking about how can we dream an anti-racist world and really take stock of our own beliefs and biases and how they're showing up, I think we can dream a world that is anti-classist as well, and begin to center the needs of people.
I want to touch on another question that we got here from Patricia, who touches on something that I think comes up an awful lot on this, because we did start our conversation talking about this moment that is so much about race in America. She says this is also a subtopic of class conflict. The rich don't want the poor or working class living anywhere near them. Jackie, this is something that I think comes up a lot in your reporting. There is class division certainly within Connecticut suburbs, but race is its own issue, and sometimes that is the very thing that people do not want to talk about. They don't want to say that out loud. They say that it's about that perhaps it's about low income communities, but it really ends up being about race. How do you direct an answer to Patricia there?
I think you can look at a place like Weston, who had a rally last weekend around Black Lives Matter, and then look at their housing concentration being 95% single family homes. They have 8 affordable housing units in town. Actions speak louder than words. You say that you care about Black lives at a rally. It's another thing to show up at the zoning meeting and support having more multi-units, so you will get some economic diversity in that town. I could go on and on with different examples of different towns and sort of the irony that's going on in some of these suburban protests or rallies that are going on right now. It's a matter of priorities, and it's one thing to hold a sign and stand in solidarity and thoughts and with you. It's another thing to speak up and go to the policymakers who are making decisions and saying, change that zoning law so that I don't need 70 acres in Monroe to build. So I don't need 15 acres in Avon to build a multi-unit. It just comes down to, are you going to the right people to lodge your complaints? Are you going to somewhere that you think people are going to hear that you care about Black Lives Matter?
Alexis, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I can say I've had mixed feelings seeing a lot of the rallies that have happened around our state, knowing some of the experiences I've had in some of those places and experiences that family and friends have had. So I do think that actions absolutely speak louder than words. And so, whether it's the issue of housing or policing, educational disparities, I think this really is a moment for people to do some reflection and think about, what did they say when they went to the town meeting or the zoning hearing, or what has been their past, what has been the history of their actions in the past, and why is this an opportunity to kind of reflect on that, and what are you going to do the next time, right? What are you going to do the next time that Karen comes in and says, I want to build such and such here in blank town? What's going to be your statement at the zoning hearing? So I do think that it's an opportunity for people to reflect and figure out what they're going to do the next time.
But I'm glad.
And I hope that we won't. I hope we can shift out of a frame that sees this, and it's mentioned in a little bit earlier, but sees this as something that's being done for the benefit of the Black and brown families, right? And that we can get to the point where towns can recognize what's missing, in their communities by living such a segregated life. You know, I had a conversation with somebody not too long ago who made a statement that said, you know, I wish that all kids could have the education that kids who attend Amity schools attends. And, you know, my response was that I'm not sure that Amity schools is the epitome of education. If you can attend those schools and go through and have, you know, a very segregated experience, if you can go through and never be taught by a teacher of color, if you can go through and not have a diverse curriculum, right? I think we have to challenge what we accept as normal, as good, as the goal. I think we have to challenge what we think about as and what we label as good neighborhoods and bad neighborhoods, right? That all of that is something that I think we have to be willing to struggle with if we're willing to really try to create something that is an anti-racist space.
Look, research shows for kids who grow up in diverse communities, it teaches them how to be critical thinkers. It teaches them how to think differently because different perspectives come to the table.
Right.
And we're not doing that for our kids, then what are we doing? I interviewed a woman who grew up in Westport this morning, and she was white, very affluent, and she didn't realize what she grew up in until she left. And she's very self-aware now that she doesn't know how to act around or how to have conversations with minorities, and that's her reality, and she's working through that right now. But some people maybe never come to that reality, or I mean, there's just so much lost by living in a bubble. I mean, our world is not a bubble.
Mm-hmm.
Alexis?
Yeah, one thing that I have been thinking about a lot the last few weeks is, you know, with schools closed, the opportunity that was missed, right? And so how would educators have responded to this movement that's happening, and how would they have engaged with their students around that, right? And I do think that there would have been a big difference in the way that some towns would have been able to address it versus others, right? And what does that mean, right? How does that you had a moment, you would have had a moment to really have an impact on your students in a way that, you know, that they would have remembered forever, right? And could have really been life-changing for them and shaped them in a way. And so I have been thinking a lot about that. And obviously, you know, distance learning has taken different forms, but had we been in school, and had educators had the opportunity to be able to reach out and touch their students, what would that have looked like?
Before we run out of time, I mean, we've talked a little bit about this, about designing a better future for this issue of housing in Connecticut. And I'd like to go a little bit further and just think about some practical steps or some things that we actually think that we can do to take advantage of the opportunities that have been put in front of us. We don't have these opportunities necessarily for great reasons right now in America, but a lot of people are taking a much closer look at the lives that they're living and the lives that others are leading. Karen, I guess I'll start with you. I mean, where do you think that we can go from here and capitalize on something that looks like a better, fairer system of getting people places to live in our state?
Well, I think that we can continue to support or begin to support efforts that have been discussed on our conversation tonight that will increase the investment in the communities that have already historically been providing the services. We can't disinvest there. That will invest in communities that have not yet begun to provide the housing, but that we do the work to create the awareness in each of us that makes those spaces something that feels welcoming to families. And I think if we can all continue to move forward with, you know, I think you can't unsee what you've once seen. And so for whatever reasons, people weren't aware of these disparities before. They've been seen now. And so I think we've got to move forward now with some commitment that what we've seen, we're going to continue to notice, We're going to continue to notice what we have accepted as just the way things are, and begin to dream about how they could be different, and then take active steps. And we'll each do that in our own way, in our own lane. But we each have ways in which we can challenge things that have historically and present day excluded too many people. And we can each take actions that can open that up and create more opportunity.
Jackie, how about you? I mean, anything that comes out of this with all the reporting that you've done, where you see either people talking about or trying to design better systems, just something that makes this problem of housing segregation, housing affordability in our state, makes it a bit better?
So I think sort of if you want change immediately, you're talking about regionalizing schools. But I also interviewed the chairman of the housing committee, the education committee today, and he laughed at me when I brought it up. That fight was had last year, and it didn't go well. And so what does that leave us with in the legislature as far as state policy changes? You have the chairman of the education committee who is on board with, thinking big and thinking regionalization, but we are suburban dominated legislature. We also have, our legislature has been dominated by Democrats for the last 23 years. And we still are one of the most segregated places in the country. I think in order to move forward, you have to have people acknowledging that it's a problem. And until you do that, and acknowledging that you're willing to give up something in your mind, that you're willing to give up something in order to achieve something. Look, you're going to pay for schools no matter if these kids are in your school or if they're in wherever these kids are going to school. They're going to be, the state's going to be spending money for it. Taxpayers are going to be spending money for them. It's just a matter of where kids are. Are you going to reshuffle them, or are you going to keep them in segregated school districts? So that's the immediate. Sort of longer term, you can talk about housing policy reforms. Again, in 2017, there was an epic debate with the legislature and Governor Malloy, and he lost. Is this the moment where the legislature is going to have an aha moment of we need to make some changes? I don't know. That's to be determined. But the two most recent debates in the legislature on this did not go well.
This idea, and I'd love your thoughts, Alexis, with some closing ideas. But this idea of people having to give up something is something that a lot of people around the state who have made it very good are just unwilling to talk about. I've been thinking a lot about the term opportunity hoarding. This notion that some people in our society are just trying to make sure that the opportunity is here and it doesn't actually go to anybody else. And that is an extreme form, I think, of NIMBYism. It's an extreme form of not wanting to give something up. You said a couple of times tonight that you're hopeful for some various reasons. So let us end on perhaps a hopeful note, or hopeful about some way in which we can move forward out of all this and design something a bit better.
Yeah, I think people's realization of the disparities is something that makes me hopeful. The Attorney General from Minnesota, who is prosecuting the officers in the George Floyd case, made a comment recently that that incident sparked the protests, but it was really, joblessness, unemployment, and poor housing that was the kindling for the fire, right? And so I think if people recognize the lack of investment we've made in training individuals for jobs, the lack of investment that we've made in providing safe housing for people, the lack of investment we've made in making our court system, accessible for people, and minimizing the disparities that exist there. I'm hopeful that we can really invoke some real change. There's been a movement around the country for a right to counsel in civil cases. So we all know that I'm if you have been accused of a crime and you can't afford a lawyer, you're provided one by the public defender's office. There's also this movement to do the same thing in civil cases, because there's the recognition that things like eviction, things like being a victim of domestic violence and having to get a restraining order, and having to divorce an abusive spouse, things like, facing deportation, all of those have real impact on your ability to be safe, your ability to participate in society, and really contribute. And so most of the right to counsel efforts have been around evictions and been around housing. So that's providing lawyers for anyone that needs an eviction. Whether we can get there in Connecticut, I don't know, but there has been some talk around that, and I think that would provide relief to a lot of individuals, because I think, and maybe I'm biased because I am a lawyer, but I think many times we can make a positive difference in negotiating, in telling stories, and providing relief for people that need it.
I want to thank you all for taking part in this conversation. There's clearly so much more that we can talk about. In this comment field that you see on your screen, there are a number of resources, links to stories, links to various groups that you can take part in. Please take a look at that. Maybe you can copy some of those links for yourselves before we go away, because I think it's really important that we're able to, in a conversation like this, share some resources, some ways in which we can continue this conversation in very productive ways. Alexis and Karen and Jacqueline, thank you all so much for being a part of this. And as I bring Elizabeth back in to close us out, I'll just say the thing I always say when I do something for the International Festival of Arts and Ideas: people do not take this for granted. Every city in America does not have this. In a lot of places, if they had something like this, it wouldn't have happened this year. They would have put up the tent and they would have said, well, come back again in 2021. They've done an amazing series of events to keep these conversations going, because they're so committed to New Haven, to Greater New Haven, and to the state of Connecticut and the region. So I just want to thank the folks at the International Festival of Arts and Ideas for doing what they do. And like I said, please don't take this for granted, because not everyone has this all over the country. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you all. I always learn so much listening in and getting to be a host to these conversations. So thank you everybody for your comments. Please continue to let us know what you think. We have a survey. It's www.artidea.org/survey. We would love to hear more of your thoughts. We're going to keep talking about this through different lenses. Join us on Tuesday. We're going to have a conversation about who gets to be essential, what that means, and identity politics in American democracy with the one and only Kalila Brown Dean. So please come on back. It's a great pleasure to spend time with you, and I hope you'll have a great night.